Paul McCartney threw the biggest party of 1967. 2 days later, Jimmy did this with Sgt. Pepper. What happened next shocked the Beatles. June 1, 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that would change music forever. It was their masterpiece, the culmination of years of experimentation, months of studio work, and every ounce of creative energy they possessed. The album was revolutionary. Orchestras, sound effects, lyrics that meant something, production techniques that had never been attempted before. The recording had taken over 700 hours of studio time. The Beatles had essentially lived in Abbey Road studios for months, trying things that had never been done. Producer George Martin had become the fifth Beatle, helping realize their wildest sonic experiments. Paul McCartney was proud. This wasn't just another Beatles album. This was art. To celebrate, Paul threw a massive party at his London home on June 1st. Everyone who mattered in the music scene was there. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, Donovan. The party went late into the night, Sgt. Pepper playing on repeat. Meanwhile, across London, Jimi Hendrix bought a copy of the album. He'd heard about it. Everyone had. The Beatles were the biggest band in the world, and their new album was all anyone could talk about. Music shops had lines around the block on release day. Jimmy stood in line like everyone else, paid his money, and took the record back to his flat in Upper Berkeley Street. He put it on his turntable and listened. Jimmy was mesmerized. Here was everything he'd been trying to achieve. Music that broke boundaries, that refused to accept limitations, that treated the studio as an instrument itself. The Beatles had proven what Jimmy believed. Rock music could be as artistically valid as any symphony, any jazz composition, any art form. Then he picked up his guitar and started learning the songs. Noel Redding, his bass player, stopped by the flat on Saturday and found Jimmy surrounded by sheet music paper scribbling chord progressions. "What are you doing?" Noel asked. "Figuring out what they did here," Jimmy said, rewinding the record to listen to a section again. "Listen to this chord progression. It's not standard. They're doing something different." "It just came out yesterday," Noel said. "You're already analyzing it like it's a classical piece?" "It is a classical piece, just with electric guitars." This was Sunday, June 4, 1967, just 3 days after the album's release. Jimmy had a show that night at the Seville Theatre in London. Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, owned the venue. It was a prestigious booking, and the audience would include music industry insiders, journalists, and possibly some Beatles themselves. Jimmy's manager, Chas Chandler, came by the flat that afternoon for a pre-show meeting. He found Jimmy obsessively working out the chords to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. "What are you doing?" Chas asked. "Learning this." He nodded at the album cover propped against the wall. "That just came out on Thursday. You can't possibly have learned it already." "I'm going to open the show with it tonight," Jimmy said. Chas stared at him. "You're going to open with a Beatles song? A song that's been out for 3 days? Are you crazy?" "It's a tribute," Jimmy explained. "The Beatles are gods, man. This album is incredible. I want to show respect." "Jimmy, you can't just perform someone else's brand new song without asking, especially the Beatles, especially their title track. That's bold to the point of insane." Jimmy smiled. "Then it's perfect for me." Chas knew better than to argue when Jimmy made up his mind, but he was nervous. What if the Beatles took it as an insult? What if the audience thought Jimmy was trying to ride the Beatles' success? What if Jimmy couldn't pull it off after only a few hours of practice? That evening, the Seville Theatre was packed. Word had spread that Jimi Hendrix was performing, and tickets were hot. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, Jimmy, Noel Redding on bass, and Mitch Mitchell on drums, had been building a reputation as one of the most exciting live acts in London. Their performances were explosive, unpredictable, and unlike anything else happening in music. In the audience that night were Paul McCartney and George Harrison. They'd come to see what all the fuss was about. They'd heard about this American guitarist who was setting London on fire, but they hadn't seen him perform yet. Brian Epstein, who owned the venue and managed the Beatles, had personally invited them. The lights dimmed. The crowd quieted. Jimi walked on stage, guitar already in hand. No introduction, no warm-up. He stepped to the microphone, looked out at the audience, and said just 6 words. "This is for the Beatles." Then he launched into Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The opening chord rang out, instantly recognizable. The crowd gasped. Was he really doing what they thought he was doing? The album had been out for 3 days. 3 days! And here was Jimi Hendrix performing the title track note perfect with his own Hendrix twist. The guitar work sharper, louder, more aggressive, but still respectful to the original. In the audience, Paul McCartney's jaw dropped. He looked at George Harrison. George looked back at Paul. Neither could quite believe what they were hearing. Jimi didn't just play the song, he inhabited it. He took the carefully produced studio track that the Beatles had spent weeks perfecting and transformed it into a raw, live, electric experience. Where the Beatles' version was polished and precise, with multiple guitar overdubs and studio effects, Jimi's was wild and immediate, everything happening right there in real time. But it wasn't a parody, it wasn't mockery, it wasn't showing off. It was genuine tribute filtered through Jimi's unique musical voice. His guitar screamed where the Beatles had hummed. His rhythm was fiercer, more aggressive. Mitch Mitchell's drumming was harder than Ringo's measured beats on the record. But somehow, impossibly, it was still recognizably the same song. Jimi hadn't changed the melody or the structure. He'd changed the energy, the intensity, the raw power behind it. People in the audience who'd been at Paul's party 2 nights earlier couldn't believe what they were hearing. This was the song they'd listened to on repeat, analyzed, discussed, celebrated. And here it was being transformed before their eyes by someone who'd only heard it for the first time 72 hours ago. The song was less than 2 minutes long. When it ended, the theater erupted in applause. Not polite appreciation, wild, genuine shock and excitement. Jimi smiled, nodded once, and then launched into his own songs. But for Paul and George, the rest of the show was a blur. They kept looking at each other, silently communicating the same thought. Did that just happen? Did he really just do what we think he did? After the show, Paul and George went backstage. They found Jimi in his dressing room, toweling off sweat, still buzzing from the performance. "That was," Paul started, then couldn't find words. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen," George finished. Jimi looked genuinely surprised by their presence. "Paul, George, hey man, I hope it was okay that I played your song. I should have asked first, but I just heard the album and I couldn't wait. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." Paul shook his head in amazement. "It came out 3 days ago. How did you learn it that fast?" Jimi shrugged. "I listened to it a few times. It's not that complicated once you understand the structure." "Not that complicated?" George laughed. "We spent weeks on that song. The production, the layers, getting it perfect. And you learned it in an afternoon?" "Well, I didn't learn all the production stuff, just the core song. The guitar, the melody, the feel. That's the part I can play." Paul was still processing. "You open your show with our song, our brand new song. That's the greatest compliment anyone's ever given us." "It deserved it," Jimi said simply. "That album is going to change music. I wanted to honor that." This moment, this brief conversation backstage, would become legendary in rock history. Here were the Beatles, the biggest band in the world, humbled by this American guitarist who just arrived in London months earlier. And here was Jimi, so in awe of the Beatles that he'd learned their album in a weekend and performed it as tribute. The mutual respect was immediate and deep. Paul and George invited Jimi to parties, to recording sessions, to just hang out and play music. The Beatles were fascinated by Jimi's technique, his fearlessness, his ability to make the guitar sound like nothing they'd ever heard before. Jimi, in turn, absorbed everything he could from the Beatles. He loved their willingness to experiment, their refusal to make the same album twice, their understanding that music could be art and commerce at the same time. But that night at the Seville Theater was special because it revealed something about both the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix. The Beatles had just released what they thought was the final word in rock music, the album that would define the era. And within 3 days, Jimi had learned it, performed it, and shown that music wasn't about having the final word. Music was a conversation. The Beatles said something brilliant with Sgt. Pepper, and Jimi responded with his own interpretation, which honored the original while adding his own voice. Years later, Paul would tell this story in interviews, always with the same sense of wonder. "We released the album on Thursday," he'd say. "On Sunday, Jimi opened his show with the title track. We were there. George and I just looked at each other like, what the hell? It was the most amazing thing. We'd worked on that album for months, and Jimi just absorbed it in a weekend and made it his own." George Harrison would add his own perspective. "That's when I knew Jimi was different from everyone else. It wasn't just that he was technically brilliant. Lots of guitarists are technically brilliant. It's that he understood music on a deeper level. He heard Sgt. Pepper and immediately understood what we were trying to do, and he celebrated it by performing it his way. That takes not just skill, but genuine artistic understanding." The story spread through London's music scene immediately. By Monday morning, everyone in the industry was talking about it. "Did you hear what Jimi Hendrix did? He played Sgt. Pepper the night after it came out, 3 days after release, and Paul and George were there." For Jimi, it was just a natural expression of respect. He'd always been generous in acknowledging the artists he admired. But for everyone else, it was a statement about his confidence and his abilities. Only someone absolutely certain of their own talent would dare to perform the Beatles' brand new masterpiece 3 days after its release in front of the Beatles themselves. The Beatles, for their part, were genuinely moved. They were used to people trying to copy them, compete with them, tear them down. But Jimi had done something different. He'd celebrated them. He'd taken their work and shown it from a new angle, proving that great music inspires more great music. This moment also marked a shift in the relationship between the Beatles and the emerging guitar rock scene. Before Jimi, the Beatles were the undisputed kings of innovation in popular music. After that night at the Seville Theater, they had to share that throne. Jimi had shown that he was operating on the same level, not as a competitor, but as a peer. Paul would later admit that Jimi's performance influenced the Beatles' thinking about their own music. Seeing Jimi take our song and make it immediate, raw, electric, it reminded us that studio perfection isn't everything. Sometimes you need that live energy, that spontaneity. It's part of why we wanted to do Let It Be as a more raw, live-feeling album. The Sgt. Pepper tribute also demonstrated something crucial about Jimi's character. He was supremely confident in his abilities, yes, but he wasn't arrogant. He recognized genius when he heard it, and he wasn't afraid to bow to it. The Beatles were masters, and Jimi honored that, but he honored it in his own way, showing that respect doesn't mean imitation. It means understanding and reinterpretation. Brian Epstein, who owned the Seville Theater and managed the Beatles, was in the audience that night too. He sat in his usual box seat, watching carefully. Brian had impeccable taste. He discovered the Beatles, after all, and he prided himself on recognizing talent. But even he wasn't prepared for what Jimi did that night. After the show, he told Chas Chandler, "That's the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen at one of my venues, and I've seen the Beatles perform hundreds of times. That wasn't just musicianship, that was artistic dialogue." Jimi heard what the Beatles said with Sgt. Pepper, understood it completely, and responded with his own voice within 72 hours. That's not normal. That's genius. The next day, Monday morning, the music press got hold of the story. By afternoon, every musician in London was talking about it. Journalists called Paul and George for comment. What did they think about Jimi performing their brand new song? Were they offended? Flattered? Shocked? All of the above, Paul told Melody Maker, but mostly just amazed. The album came out Thursday. We had a party that night, feeling pretty pleased with ourselves. By Sunday, Jimi had learned it, made it his own, and performed it better than we could have played it live. That's when you know you're dealing with someone truly special. The performance was never officially recorded, which adds to its legendary status. No video exists, no audio recording, just the memories of the people who were there and the stories they've told over the decades. In a way, this makes the moment even more special. It exists only in the collective memory of those few hundred people in the Savile Theatre that night. For Paul McCartney, the moment remained one of the highlights of his entire career, not because of anything the Beatles did, but because of what Jimi did. Paul had thrown a party to celebrate Sgt. Pepper, confident they'd created something unprecedented. 2 days later, a guitarist they barely knew proved that great art immediately inspires more great art. Paul McCartney threw the biggest party of 1967 to celebrate what he thought was the definitive musical statement of the era. 2 days later, Jimi Hendrix showed him that in music there are no final statements, only conversations. And the conversation Jimi started that night at the Savile Theatre between the Beatles' studio perfection and his own raw electric power continues to echo through rock music today. If this story of mutual respect and artistic brilliance moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who loves the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, or just great music history. Have you ever been inspired so quickly by someone's art that you had to respond immediately? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video for more untold stories from music's greatest legends.